The abandoned campsite outside the town hadn't been used for years. Or at least, that's what we thought. When we set up our tents, we found signs that someone had been living there. The problem was, they never disturbed us. Because they were waiting. Before we start the story, let me know in the comments where you're from, and when you're watching this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. My name is Daniel. I'm 28 years old, and I've always loved being in nature, camping under the stars. But after what happened 2 years ago, I swore I'd never spend another night alone in the woods again. It happened during a camping trip with 4 of my friends, Ryan, Emily, Jake, and Olivia. Olivia had told us about an old, abandoned campsite that wasn't even on the maps. It's completely isolated, she said. Hardly anyone goes there anymore, but the view is amazing. Excited, we all agreed. That day, we packed up and drove towards the campsite. Along the way, we passed rusted signs, collapsed cabins, and broken metal poles. It was clear no one had been here in years. When we arrived, everything seemed normal. The trees were dense, but there was a clearing perfect for our campfire. We set up our tents, lit the fire, and enjoyed our night. But as soon as it got dark, strange things started happening. First, we heard rustling sounds coming from the trees. There was no wind, so we assumed it was an animal. But the noises gradually turned into what sounded like human footsteps. Ryan muttered, "Maybe someone else is camping here." But when we looked around, there were no other tents or lights. Just past midnight, Olivia suddenly froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing at the tree line. We squinted into the darkness, but at first, we saw nothing. Then, as Ryan flicked his lighter to brighten the fire, we all saw it. A tall, thin figure, standing there, just beyond the trees. But it had no face. It was only a shadowy silhouette. Jake immediately stood up. "Is someone messing with us?" he shouted. The figure didn't respond. Then, it moved. But not like a normal person. It twitched, appearing in different spots in an instant. Olivia panicked and pulled out her phone, but the screen was dead. All our phones had shut off at the same time. At that moment, instinct took over, and I yelled, "Run!" We abandoned the campsite, our gear, everything, and sprinted through the forest. No matter how far we ran, the footsteps followed. Eventually, we reached the end of the trail and came across an old wooden sign. The words were faded, but one final line was still readable. "Don't stay too long." And then, Olivia screamed. We turned around. Ryan was gone. And so was the shadowy figure. We never saw Ryan again. The next day, we called the police, but they found nothing. Not even Ryan's belongings. But the strangest thing. A few weeks later, Olivia got a message on her phone. An unknown number. The message contained only 3 words. "Don't come back. It's waiting." My name is Nathan. I'm 27 years old, and I've always loved being in nature. Since I was a child, I've gone camping, and I know the peace of getting lost in the depths of the forest and just listening to the sounds of nature. But that camping trip, it taught me that nature isn't always peaceful. That weekend, I planned a camping trip with 3 close friends, Alex, Jason, and Emily. We decided to explore an old campsite a few hours outside our town. It was a forgotten place with little information even on Google Maps. A few forums mentioned that this campsite was once popular but had been abandoned suddenly. No one could explain why. Hearing that, our curiosity only grew. Finally, we hit the road. Arrival at the campsite. When we arrived at the campsite, there was no one around. We had seen a few abandoned cabins along the way, but as we got closer to the campsite, everything grew silent. Normally, The forest would be filled with birds' calls and the rustling of the wind in the trees. But here, there was complete silence. Emily started setting up the first tent, Jason gathered wood to make a fire, and Alex went looking for a water source. I was scanning the area. There were some abandoned items left behind by previous campers. Rusty cans, a moldy backpack, and a table that seemed untouched for years. But the most striking thing were the marks carved into the trees. Scratches, numbers, some symbols. None of them made sense. But one of them was carved into a large tree that overlooked the spot where we were setting up our tents. "Don't spend the night here." When I saw that, a chill ran down my spine. But I didn't tell my friends. I didn't want them to think I was scared. Night begins. As the sun set, we sat around the fire and started telling stories. We drank wine and laughed. For a moment, we forgot about how strange the place felt. But after midnight, things started to change. At first, we heard noises. At first, we thought it was just the wind. But no, it was much stranger. It was as if whispers were rising from the forest, like two people talking to each other in low voices. But the words were unintelligible. Jason stood up. "I think this place isn't as abandoned as we thought," he said, grabbing a flashlight and pointing it into the woods. But there was nothing. Then Alex headed for his tent. "I think we should sleep," he said. "Maybe we're just tired. That's why we feel like this." Just as we were about to retreat to our tents, Emily froze. Her eyes were fixed on the trees just beyond the campsite. "Did you see that?" she whispered. We turned to look in the direction she was pointing, and there it was. A shadow. Between two trees, there was a human silhouette standing still. It was clear, but it wasn't moving. It was just there, standing still. Alex quickly aimed the flashlight in that direction. But when the light illuminated the shadow, there was nothing. In an empty forest, we had seen a shadow. But there was no explanation for it. The disappearing tent. We were trembling with fear, but no one wanted to show it. We tried to sleep in our tents. But all night, I felt uneasy. My sleep was constantly interrupted. The whispers from the forest seemed to be getting closer. By morning, we realized something was wrong. Jason's tent was gone. This old campsite, out of the way and even absent from maps, used to be popular. But one day, it was abandoned suddenly. Rumors said that people had gone missing here, and no one had the courage to return. Those stories didn't stop us. I, Nick, Emily, and Jason were 4 adventurous friends, and we decided to spend the weekend camping there. After a long journey, we arrived at the campsite. In the depths of the forest, we found an open space where the old area had been. We came across abandoned picnic tables and a decaying cabin. It was once used by people, but now it was just silent. After setting up our tents, we began to explore the area. Jason and Nick decided to enter the cabin, while Emily and I wandered around the campsite. In the forest, we found old, moss-covered signs. Some of them had nearly faded, writing, "Don't enter past here," and "Think twice before you turn back." When we returned to the campsite, we learned that Jason and Nick had found an old, dusty journal in the cabin. The journal contained horrifying lines written by someone who had camped there. Whispers at midnight. I feel someone watching me between the trees. I can hear another's breath on my neck, but when I turn, no one is there. That night, sitting by the campfire, we began to hear strange noises. It sounded like the wind, but more rhythmic, almost like someone was talking. "We're just imagining it," Emily said, but the sounds were growing clearer. At midnight, Jason suddenly stood up. "I think I saw something," he said, shining his flashlight deep into the forest. There was nothing. But we all felt it. Someone, or something, was watching us. Suddenly, Nick panicked and rushed out of his tent, breathless. Someone was breathing outside my tent. We froze. Then, we heard a rustling sound. A step. Then another. A silhouette appeared between the trees. A long, slender figure, but bigger than a human. It had no eyes, but we could feel its presence. We were frozen. The thing was getting closer, step by step. Jason suddenly shouted, "Run!" We panicked and ran, leaving our campsite and belongings behind, fleeing into the darkness. We ran breathlessly between the trees. But that thing wasn't leaving us behind. We reached a path, but at that moment, Emily looked back, and in a breathless whisper she said, "Where's Nick?" Nick was gone. Since that day, no one has heard from him. The police went to the campsite, but they couldn't find Nick, nor could they explain what we had seen. But sometimes, at night, people passing near the campsite say they hear whispers. A voice asking in a hoarse tone, "Why did you leave me here?" My name is Marcus, I'm 31 years old, and I've always loved spending time outdoors. I've been to abandoned towns, deep into the forests, and to places where no one dares to go. But that one trip, it taught me that nature isn't always peaceful. That weekend, I planned a camping trip with 3 close friends, Nathan, Emily, and Jason. We decided to explore an old campsite a few hours outside our town. It was a forgotten place, barely showing up on Google Maps. A few forums mentioned that the campsite used to be popular but was abandoned suddenly. No one ever explained why. When we heard this, our curiosity grew even more. So, we set off. Arrival at the campsite. When we arrived, there was no one around. Along the way, we saw a few abandoned cabins, but as we approached the campsite, everything fell into a strange silence. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, but here, it was dead quiet. Emily started setting up the first tent, Jason gathered firewood, and Alex went off to look for a water source. I was just surveying the area. We found some old belongings left by previous campers, rusted tin cans, a moldy backpack, and a table that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But the most striking thing were the symbols carved into the trees. Scratches, numbers, some symbols. None of them made sense. But one of them was carved into a big tree that faced the area where we had set up our tents. "Don't spend the night here." When I saw that, I felt a chill run down my spine. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want them to think I was scared. The night begins. As the sun set, we sat around the fire telling stories, drinking wine, laughing. For a moment, we forgot about the oddness of the place. But after midnight, things started to change. First, the sounds came. At first, we thought it was just the wind. But no, it was something much stranger. It was like whispers rising from the forest. It sounded like 2 people speaking softly to each other. But the words were unintelligible. Jason stood up. "I think this place isn't as abandoned as we thought," he said, grabbing his flashlight and shining it into the woods. But there was nothing. Then Alex headed to his tent. "I think we should just sleep. Maybe we're just tired." Just as we were about to retreat to our tents, Emily froze. Her eyes were locked on the trees just beyond our campsite. "Did you see that?" she whispered. We turned and looked in the direction she was pointing. And there it was. A shadow. Between 2 trees, a human silhouette stood still. It was clear, but it didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. Alex quickly shined the flashlight in its direction. But when the light hit the shadow, there was nothing. We had seen something in an empty forest that didn't belong. But there was no explanation. The disappearing tent. We were trembling with fear, but none of us wanted to admit it. We went into our tents and tried to sleep. But I couldn't rest. My sleep was constantly interrupted. The whispers from the forest seemed to be getting closer. By morning, we realized something was wrong. Jason's tent was gone. In the middle of nowhere, in a place that wasn't even on maps, we were in an old campsite that had been abandoned years ago. The stories of people disappearing from this very area were well known. But we hadn't let those stories stop us. We, Nick, Emily, Jason, and I, were a group of adventurous friends, and we were determined to camp here for the weekend. After a long journey, we found the old campsite deep in the woods. It was in a clearing, with abandoned picnic tables and a decaying cabin. The place was once inhabited, but now only silence reigned. After setting up our tents, we began exploring the area. Jason and Nick decided to enter the cabin while Emily and I walked around the campsite. We found old, moss-covered signs deep in the woods. Some of the signs had barely readable warnings. Do not enter after this point. Think twice before you turn back. When we returned to the campsite, we learned that Jason and Nick had found an old, dusty journal in the cabin. The journal contained terrifying entries from someone who had camped here before. Whispers at midnight. I feel like someone is watching me from the trees. I can feel someone's breath on my neck, but when I turn around, no one is there. That night, as we sat around the campfire, we began hearing strange noises. It sounded like the wind, but it was more rhythmic, almost like someone talking. It's just our imagination, Emily said, but the sounds grew clearer. By midnight, Jason suddenly jumped to his feet. I saw something, he shouted, and shone his flashlight deep into the forest. There was nothing, but we all felt it. Someone or something was watching us. Suddenly, Nick panicked and rushed out of his tent. Someone was breathing outside my tent. We froze. Then we heard a rustling, a footstep, then another. A figure emerged between the trees. It was tall, thinner than a person, but larger than any known creature. It had no eyes, only hollow black sockets. We froze. That thing was stepping closer to us. Jason suddenly shouted, "Run!" We bolted, leaving our campsite and everything behind, running into the dark. We were out of breath, lost in the trees. But that thing, it wouldn't leave us. We finally reached a path, but at that moment, Emily turned around and, out of breath, whispered, "Where's Nick?" Nick was gone. After that day, no one ever heard from him again. The police went to the campsite, but they couldn't find Nick, nor could they explain what we had seen. But sometimes, on certain nights, people passing near that campsite report hearing whispers. Someone asks in a hoarse voice, "Why did you leave me here?"